I want you to picture something. Picture a man sitting behind a desk on the 50th floor of a building he owns, in a city where his name is on more steel and glass than most people will ever touch in a lifetime. Picture that man watching the morning light cut across a skyline that he helped shape, not with luck, not with inheritance, not with the right last name, but with 20 years of grinding so relentless it rearranged something fundamental inside him, something that never quite grew back the way it was supposed to. Now picture that same man reaching into his desk safe at 7:43 in the morning and pulling out a blueprint so old the paper has gone soft at the folds, the lines slightly faded, the handwritten annotations in pencil still legible if you hold it at the right angle. A blueprint he has kept, not framed, not displayed, not shown to anyone, but folded inside a manila envelope, sitting in that safe for 19 years, the way you might keep an old photograph of someone who hurt you, not because you love them, because you made a promise. And then picture his secretary's voice coming through the intercom. Calm, professional. "Sir, there's a professor here to see you. He's been waiting in reception for just over 2 hours. He says it's urgent. He says, and I'm quoting him directly, that you are his last option." I set the blueprint on my desk. I straightened my cufflinks. I said, "Send him in." And here's what I need you to understand before I tell you the rest of the story. I was not angry. I was not nervous. I was not even particularly satisfied. Not yet. I was something else entirely. I was the version of a person that only gets built when someone breaks you thoroughly enough, early enough, that you spend 2 decades constructing yourself back from the foundation up, and when you're done, what's standing is not quite what was there before. It's better, and it's worse. At the same time, that's what this story's about. Not just what he did to me, not just what I did in return, but what it costs, really costs, to win the way I won, because I want you to know that part too. I want you to hear it in full, so let me start at the beginning, the real beginning, before the university, before the professor, before any of it. Let me tell you about the kid I used to be, and what that kid believed about the world, because that belief is what made the betrayal possible. I grew up in a mid-sized city in Ohio, the kind of place where the downtown has 2 or 3 buildings that qualify as tall, and everyone treats them like landmarks. My father was a machinist. My mother worked reception at a dental office for 22 years. We were not poor, exactly, but money was a language our house spoke quietly, carefully, with a lot of pauses. You knew not to ask for certain things. You learned early that wanting something meant figuring out how to earn it yourself. What I wanted, from the time I was probably 9 or 10 years old, was to build things. Not assemble kits, not stack blocks. I mean actually build. I would spend hours sketching buildings in the margins of my school notebooks. Houses that didn't look like any house on our street. Towers that didn't look like anything in our city. I had this, I don't know how else to describe it, this obsession with the idea that a building could say something, that the shape of a structure, the way light moved through it, the relationship between its height and its surroundings, could communicate something to the people inside it and around it. That architecture was a form of language. My 8th grade art teacher, a woman I remember only as warm and slightly overwhelmed, once held up one of my drawings in class. A sketch I'd done of an imaginary civic center, a public library with a curved glass facade that I'd spent 3 weeks refining in the margins of my science notes. She said in front of everyone, "Whoever drew this should be an architect." I didn't say it out loud, but something locked into place in my chest right then, like a key turning. After that, I was deliberate about it in a way most teenagers are not deliberate about anything. I checked out library books on architectural history. I watched every documentary I could find on famous buildings and the people who designed them. I kept sketchbooks, real ones, not just notebook margins, and I filled them with ideas that were probably terrible in ways I couldn't yet recognize. but that came from a genuine place, a place of belief, of excitement about what a building could be. I graduated high school with a GPA that I worked for in a very literal sense. Not because I was brilliant, because I sat at the kitchen table after my parents went to bed, and I did the work. I applied for scholarships. I got 2. They were not enough. My parents helped with the rest in ways that I know cost them, and that I have never fully stopped thinking about. I enrolled in the architecture program at Hartfield University, a state university in the Midwest with a respectable architecture school, not the most prestigious in the country, but legitimate, rigorous, taught by faculty who had actual careers in the field before moving into academia. I arrived on that campus carrying everything I owned in 2 duffel bags and a backpack. I had never been so far from home on my own. I was 18 years old. I believed, with a sincerity that now feels almost painful to remember, that if you were talented and worked hard enough, the right people would recognize it. I believed that completely. That belief is the thing he exploited. Hartfield's architecture department was housed in a building called Pryor Hall, a mid-century structure that someone had retrofitted with a glass and steel addition in the 90s that never quite felt like it belonged. The joke among the architecture students was that Pryor Hall was proof that good intentions and bad execution could coexist indefinitely. I loved it immediately. The department had around 200 undergraduates and a graduate program of maybe 60 students. The studios were open 24 hours. The smell of drafting paper, pencil shavings, and model building adhesive became so familiar to me in the first 2 weeks that it started to feel like home. More than home, honestly. More than anything I'd had before. The culture inside that program was... I want to be careful how I describe this because I think it's important. The culture was competitive in a way that had 2 faces. On the surface, it looked collaborative. Students pinned work to the crit wall together. Faculty circulated through the studio space and offered comments. There were group projects, team designs, shared resources. The language was collegial. But underneath that surface was a current of something harder, a sorting process that happened continuously, invisibly, through the way a professor lingered on one student's work longer than another's, through the specific wording of feedback, interesting approach versus genuinely compelling versus this one has something. You learned to parse those phrases very quickly. You learned to read the room. You learned that the students who received the longer lingerings were the ones who got recommended for the better internships, the better critiques, the better graduate positions. I was not, in my first 2 years, a student who received the longer lingerings. I was competent. I worked harder than most people around me. My technical execution was disciplined. Clean lines, precise measurements, well-reasoned structural thinking. But there was something in my early work that was, if I'm being honest with you, cautious. Correct without being surprising. I had not yet learned to trust my instincts far enough to actually show them on paper. I kept pulling back at the last moment, defaulting to the safe resolution instead of the risky. 1. My closest friend in those years was a guy named Lucas Walker, a third-year student from Atlanta who had gotten into architecture through a completely different door than I had. His father was a contractor, his uncle was a civil engineer, and Lucas had grown up around construction sites, the way other kids grew up around soccer fields. He didn't romanticize the field the way I did. He was practical, methodical, dry in his humor, and one of the most reliable people I've ever known. Lucas didn't care about being the best. He cared about doing the work correctly and then going home and sleeping. I envied that about him sometimes. "You're overthinking the facade," he would say, leaning over my drafting table at 11:30 at night when the studio had gone quiet. "You keep going back to it. You've revised it 6 times. The first version was the best one. The first version was too aggressive." "For who?" "For whoever grades it." Lucas would look at me for a second, then go back to his own board. He understood what I was doing. and he never tried to talk me out of it because he understood that too. In my third year, the dynamic of the department shifted, for me specifically, when a new faculty member joined the graduate program. His name, in the hallways and among the students, was always spoken with a particular kind of reverence. Even before I had a class with him, I knew who he was, the way you know who the important people are in a closed environment. You pick it up from the way other people mention them. The slight lowering of volume, the specific words used, Professor Coleman. Professor Coleman had, by the time he came to Hartfield, a legitimate reputation in the field. He had designed 3 buildings of genuine significance, a regional arts center in the South that had been featured in architectural journals, a memorial garden in the Northeast that had won a national design award, and an urban housing complex in the Midwest that was cited frequently in academic discussions of mixed-income residential design. He was in his mid-50s, silver-haired in the way that reads as distinguished rather than old, with the particular bearing of a man who had been told he was important. Often enough that it had become his natural posture. He ran the graduate thesis studio, the capstone of the 5-year architecture program, the course that determined, more than any other single element, whether a student graduated with distinction or merely graduated. You applied for his studio. Not everyone got in. I applied at the end of my 3rd year. I put together a portfolio that I worked on for 6 weeks straight. I revised the presentation twice. Lucas helped me select which projects to include and which to cut. I submitted it on a Thursday afternoon and spent the following 10 days doing a very poor impression of someone who wasn't thinking about it. The acceptance list was posted on a Monday morning in April. My name was on it. I remember standing in the hallway outside the department office, looking at the printed sheet on the bulletin board, and feeling something rise in my chest that was so large I had to step back from it. Not arrogance, not even confidence, more like permission, like someone had looked at the thing I'd been carrying all my life and said, "Yes, that's real, come in." I should have been more careful about what I attached that feeling to. The thesis studio met on Monday and Wednesday afternoons for 3 hours each session in a dedicated room on the 2nd floor of Pryor Hall. There were 8 of us admitted that year, 8 students who had all made the cut, all talented in different ways, all aware of what being in this room represented. Professor Coleman's teaching style in those early weeks was extraordinary in ways I can describe precisely because I have spent 20 years thinking about exactly what he did and how he did it. He didn't lecture, he circulated. He would move around the room slowly, stopping at each student's drafting table or model workspace, and he would ask questions, not, "What are you designing?" but "What are you trying to say?" Not, "How does this structure work?" but "What does this structure believe?" He spoke about architecture the way I had privately thought about it since I was 9 years old, as a form of language, as a conversation between a building and the people who inhabited it and the city that held it. For the first time in my academic life, I felt like someone was speaking my language. And when he stopped at my table, which he did more than at others in those first weeks, and asked his questions, my answers came out fully formed in a way that surprised even me, because I'd been thinking this way for years, privately, in the margins and the sketchbooks, and now here was a man who understood it and was drawing it out of me. "You think about threshold spaces," he said to me once, in the 3rd week, leaning over a preliminary sketch I was developing. "The moments between inside and outside, the transition zones, that's a very specific preoccupation. I think the transition is usually where the building tells you the most about itself," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, like I'd said something he needed to consider, and he moved on. After that session, Lucas, who was in a different studio that semester and met me for dinner most evenings, asked how it went. "Good," I said, "really good." Good like finally feeling seen good, or good like this professor is paying attention to you good? I paused. Both, maybe. Lucas ate his food quietly for a moment. Then, just be careful, those aren't the same thing. I didn't understand what he meant at the time, or maybe I understood and chose not to. The months that followed were the most intellectually alive I'd ever felt. I was developing a thesis project that had been building in my mind for 2 years. It centered on a concept I called earned height. The idea that a tall building in an urban context should justify its height, not through sheer ambition or square footage, but through its relationship to the ground. That the taller a structure rose, the more deliberately generous it needed to be at street level, open public spaces, permeable ground floors, a genuine investment in the pedestrian experience at the base as a kind of ethical obligation for the height above. The specific project I was designing was a mixed-use tower for a hypothetical site in the city. 47 floors, with the bottom 6 floors dedicated to publicly accessible space. A library branch, a market hall, a community meeting room, and a 2-story covered arcade that connected 2 streets that were otherwise separated by a dead block. The upper floors were residential and office. The building's structural system was designed to make the public base feel like the most important part, not a lobby, not a threshold, but a genuine gift to the city from the building above it. I called it the Civic Tower. I worked on it every day. I revised it constantly, not out of the timidity that had characterized my earlier work, but out of the deep conviction that this idea deserved to be fully realized. I built physical models at 3 different scales. I developed detailed studies of the ground floor arcade at full scale. I wrote 12 pages of design rationale that I revised until every sentence said exactly what I meant. Professor Coleman engaged with the project extensively. He came to my table every session. He asked questions. He pushed back on certain decisions. He suggested readings, 3 or 4 specific papers and essays on urban plazas and what he called the public contract of tall buildings. And I read all of them the same week he mentioned them. We started meeting outside of studio hours. Not frequently at first, maybe once a month. He would email me and suggest we continue a conversation from a studio session over coffee. I always said yes. The conversations were long, digressive, intellectually generous. He talked about his own projects. He talked about the state of the field. He talked about what was possible for someone with genuine vision. And the way he said it, the particular warmth and certainty in his voice, made it clear that he was talking about me. I want to be honest about this part. I needed it. I was 22 years old, a kid from Ohio whose parents had worked their entire adult lives to give him a chance at something they didn't fully understand. And here was a man with credentials and standing telling me that I had vision, that I had something rare. I let that become the most important thing in my world. That was my first mistake. The first shift was subtle enough that I talked myself out of noticing it. It was a Tuesday evening in November of my final year. The thesis exhibition was scheduled for the following March, 4 months out. I had met with Professor Coleman for one of our coffee sessions and spent 2 hours walking him through the current iteration of my design. I had brought my most recent drawings and a revised model. He had been quiet during most of the presentation, which was unusual. He asked fewer questions than normal. At the end, he said the project was developing well, and that he wanted to think about some of the structural decisions more carefully. He said we should meet again in 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, he rescheduled, then again the following week. I told myself he was busy. He had a full teaching load, plus his own professional practice. I told myself this was normal. Graduate students in thesis year all experience some irregularity in mentorship availability. But I also noticed, and this is the thing I should have paid more attention to, that when we did meet again, about 3 weeks after the last session, his questions had changed character slightly. They were no longer questions that pushed forward. They were questions that extracted. He asked me to explain again the rationale behind the ground floor arcade. He asked about the structural approach I'd developed for the cantilevered section at the 6th floor. He asked me to describe in detail how I'd arrived at the decision to orient the tower slightly off the street grid, a decision that I had spent weeks deliberating over and that I had written about extensively in my rationale documents. I answered all of it in full, because he was my mentor. Because explaining my thinking was part of what the relationship was. He took notes. He had not, in the earlier months of our relationship, taken notes. I noticed that too, and I set it aside. The second shift came in January. There was a competition, a real one, not academic. A regional development firm was soliciting conceptual designs for a major mixed-use tower on a prominent downtown site. The program requirements were open enough that they practically invited the kind of thinking I had been developing. When Professor Coleman mentioned it in studio one afternoon, the other students dismissed it. Too much work, too little time before the thesis exhibition. I thought about it for 3 days and then told him I was interested in entering. He was enthusiastic, more than enthusiastic. He said he would be happy to serve as my professional supervisor for the submission, which was required since I was still a student without a license. He said we should work closely on it. He said this was the kind of opportunity that could genuinely launch a career. We started meeting twice a week. I worked 18-hour days. I produced the most complete, rigorous, fully realized version of the project I had been developing all year. The competition entry was essentially an evolved version of my thesis project. Same conceptual framework, same structural system, refined and sharpened and developed to professional submission quality. I produced 43 sheets of drawings, 3 physical models, a 12-minute video walkthrough that Lucas helped me film and edit over a long weekend. Professor Coleman sat with me through much of it. He looked at the drawings. He offered edits on the written materials. He seemed, in those weeks, to be his most engaged, most present, most generous version of himself. The submission deadline was February 15th. I submitted everything on February 14th. On February 16th, Professor Coleman told me, in a brief and strangely formal email, that due to a conflict of interest he had identified in the submission process, something about his professional relationship with one of the competition jurors, he needed to withdraw as my professional supervisor. He had already filed the necessary paperwork with the competition administrators. He apologized for the inconvenience. The competition rules required a licensed professional supervisor. Without one, my entry was disqualified automatically. I read that email 3 times, then I sat in the studio, alone, at 8 in the evening, for a very long time. I told myself it was an administrative problem, something that could be fixed. I reached out to 2 other faculty members about serving as substitute supervisor. Both said the deadline had passed and the paperwork could not be resubmitted. I reached out to the competition administrators directly. They were polite and clear. The withdrawal had already been processed and the entry could not be reinstated. I had submitted 43 sheets of drawings, 3 models, and 12 minutes of video to a competition from which my entry had been administratively erased. I went and found Lucas in his studio space at around 10 that night. I sat down across from him. I told him what had happened. Lucas was quiet for a long time. "Did he know about the conflict of interest before you submitted?" he asked. "He must have," I said. "It's his professional network. He knows the jurors." Lucas looked at his drafting table. "Did he make any copies of your drawings, your files?" The question landed in a strange way. I sat with it. "The working sessions," I said slowly. "Every time we met, he had his laptop open." Neither of us said anything for a while. "You don't know that," I finally said. "There's no evidence of—" "I'm not saying anything," Lucas said. "I'm just asking what you know." What I knew was this: my project had been submitted to a competition and then removed. My mentor had known he had a conflict of interest before the submission date. He had to have known. The withdrawal was filed so quickly after the deadline that it must have been prepared in advance, and he had, over the course of months, systematically drawn out of me every dimension of my thinking, my rationale, my structural solutions, my conceptual framework. He had asked me to describe it all in detail. He had taken notes. What I didn't know, what I couldn't prove, was what any of that meant. And that uncertainty was, I think now, something he counted on. The thesis exhibition was scheduled for March. 8 students presenting 8 projects. I was one of them. I went to Professor Coleman's office on a Wednesday morning in late February. I had rehearsed what I wanted to say. I had decided I would be direct, professional, and give him the opportunity to explain. He was at his desk when I knocked. He looked up, gestured to the chair across from him, and said, "I was hoping to speak with you soon anyway." I sat down. "I want to understand what happened with the competition submission," I said. "The conflict of interest you mentioned. When did you become aware of it?" He settled back in his chair. There was a pause that was, in retrospect, too comfortable. A man managing a conversation he had prepared for. Conflicts in professional networks can be murky, he said. The relationships in this field are old and overlapping. I became aware of a potential issue during the submission week and acted on it as soon as I felt certain. The submission was on February 14th. The withdrawal was filed on February 15th. Yes. You'd been my supervisor since January. You sat with me through 43 sheets of drawings, which remain your intellectual property, of course. He said it so smoothly, so cleanly, as if saying the words intellectual property was a kind of legal prophylactic, as if the phrase itself settled something. What will you do with what you saw? I asked. In the working sessions? He looked at me with something I now understand was performance, a performed expression of gentle offense. I'm not sure what you're implying, he said. But I want to be careful here, because I think you're under a great deal of stress with the thesis exhibition approaching, and I don't want a misunderstanding to damage what has been a very productive mentorship. I'm not under stress, I said. I'm asking a direct question, and I've answered it, he said. The competition withdrawal was a professional necessity. Your thesis project is your own work, and will be presented as such at the exhibition. I hope you'll bring the same energy to the final push. There was a moment between us, a very clear, very still moment. He looked at me across his desk with an expression that was composed and benevolent and utterly impenetrable, and I understood, with a clarity that felt like something cold poured between my shoulder blades, that I had nothing, no proof, no recording, no documentation, nothing except the chain of events and my own certainty about what it added up to. I stood up. I picked up my bag. I want you to know, he said, as I turned toward the door, that I think you have real talent. I genuinely do, but talent without the right temperament can become a liability. I hope you'll reflect on that. I walked out. I did not slam the door. I closed it quietly. That was harder than it sounds. The thesis exhibition happened in the first week of March. I presented my project. The panel of external reviewers gave me strong marks. One of them, a practicing architect from Chicago who had been brought in as an outside critic, spent 12 minutes at my presentation asking detailed questions and told me afterward in the hallway that my conceptual framework was among the most coherent she had encountered at the thesis level. She gave me her card and said to reach out when I was closer to licensing. I graduated with distinction. My parents drove up from Ohio and sat in the auditorium and took photographs. 3 months later, I learned through a second-year student who followed architectural competition news that the regional development competition, the one from which my entry had been withdrawn, had been won. The winning designer was announced in an architectural journal. The project was described in the article in terms I recognized with a specificity that made my vision go momentarily white. A mixed-use tower concept centered on the principle of earned height, featuring a 6-story publicly accessible base with a covered arcade connecting adjacent street corridors, oriented slightly off the primary street grid to create triangulated views of the Civic Plaza. The winning designer was listed as Professor Coleman, in partnership with a private development firm he had quietly founded the previous year. The article included a rendering. I looked at the rendering for a very long time. It was my building, refined, rendered in his firm's visual style, credited to his name. I called Lucas that night. I read him the article. He was quiet on the other end of the line. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I thought about it. I thought about lawyers and documentation, and what I could prove, and what I couldn't. I thought about being 23 years old with student loans and no professional license and no financial resources, and bringing a claim against a tenured professor at a university with institutional lawyers who handled exactly this kind of thing. I thought about all of it. "I'm going to build something," I said. "Eventually, I'm going to build something that makes what he did look like what it is." "That could take a long time," Lucas said. "I know." I didn't tell Lucas what else I did that night. After I hung up the phone, I went to the drafting table I'd set up in my apartment, the one where I'd worked on the project through all those months, and I pulled out the original blueprint, the first full-scale drawing I had made of the concept, the one that predated all the refined iterations, the one I had made in October, before the working sessions with Professor Coleman had begun, the one with my handwriting in the margins, my pencil corrections, my coffee stain in the lower left corner. I folded it carefully and put it in a manila envelope. I wrote the date on the outside. I put it in the bottom of my bag, and I kept it there. 3 months later, when I stood in the rain looking up at the building under construction on the downtown site, the steel frame rising against a November sky that offered no kindness, I transferred it from my bag to a fireproof box I bought for $19 at a hardware store, and I made myself a promise. I made it quietly in the rain, to no one who could hear me, to the building I was watching go up, to the city that didn't know who had really designed it, to a version of myself that was still standing, despite wanting very much, in that moment, not to be. Put in the comments, what would you have done that night? Would you have filed a claim? Walked away? I'm genuinely curious because at 23, I could not find the answer I was willing to live with. Keep watching. I want to skip this part. I'll be honest with you, I've told this story in my head hundreds of times, and I always want to skip this part. Not because it's the most painful, but because it's the most embarrassing. The defeat is embarrassing in a way that the injustice isn't. Because the injustice happened to me. The defeat was something I participated in. Let me tell you about the 6 years after graduation. I stayed in the city where Hartfield was located. I told myself this was strategic. The job market was better there. There was a professional network to build into. The truth was more complicated. Part of it was that leaving felt like admitting the city wasn't mine, like ceding ground to him, which was irrational, and I knew it was irrational, and I stayed anyway. I got my first job at a mid-sized architecture firm, commercial work mostly, the kind of projects that are respectable but not the kind that appear in journals. I did my time. I got licensed. I worked 60-hour weeks and saved money and told myself I was building toward something. But I was also, in a way I didn't fully admit to myself until much later, doing what a lot of people do when they've been deeply injured by someone they trusted. I was waiting for something from outside to fix it, for some external validation or comeuppance to arrive that would set things right without requiring me to actually do the difficult thing. During those years, his project, the one built from my design, became exactly what I had feared it would become. It was celebrated. It won awards. It was featured in national publications. There was a long profile of Professor Coleman in an architecture magazine my third year out of school, in which he was described as a designer who has brought a renewed attention to the relationship between tall buildings and the public realm. The phrase earned height appeared in the article as if it were his coinage. I read the article at my desk during my lunch break at the firm. I read it twice. Then I put my lunch in the trash and I went back to work on a mid-rise commercial building in the suburbs, and I did not speak to anyone for the rest of the afternoon. My first major strategic mistake came at the end of year 4. I had been working on my own time on a proposal for a competition, a legitimate one this time, properly entered in my own name, a mid-sized community center for a city in the region. I had worked on it for 5 months, alongside my full-time job. I was proud of it. I believed in it. And when the results came back, I didn't win. But I placed second, and the committee reached out to discuss whether I might be available for a commission on a related project. I was available, I took the commission. And then I made the mistake. I quit my job. Not because the commission was large enough to justify it. It wasn't. It was a genuine commission, but the fee was modest and the timeline was long, and I had no other projects in the pipeline. I quit because I was 33 months out of school and impatient, and I believed, incorrectly it turned out, that this one project was going to be the opening of something larger, that other commissions would follow, that the portfolio would build momentum. They didn't follow, not quickly enough. The community center project stretched past its original timeline. The payment schedule slipped. I burned through savings. I took on debt. I chased other bids and lost most of them. I spent 8 months in a financial situation that I now understand was genuinely precarious, cutting expenses I didn't want to cut, calling Lucas on Sunday evenings and talking around the edges of how bad it was because I was too proud to say it directly. The community center was built. It was good work. It was published in a regional architecture magazine with a small circulation. It brought in 2 small residential renovation commissions. I paid off most of the debt, and I went back to working for someone else. That was year 3. By year 5, I was at a different firm, doing better work, earning a reasonable salary, and carrying something that I can only describe now as a quiet rage that had nowhere to go, not expressed in any dramatic way, not in fights or outbursts or obvious dysfunction. It was more like a low frequency in the background of everything I did, a constant awareness of the distance between where I was and where I had intended to be, and of who had contributed to that distance. I dated during those years. I want to mention that because I think it matters to the full picture of what this kind of wound does to a person. There was a woman named Emily. She worked in city planning, which meant we had enough professional overlap to talk at length about things I cared about, which at 25 is about all you need to fall in something that resembles love. We were together for almost 2 years. She was thoughtful, and she was funny, and she was patient with me in ways I didn't fully deserve. She ended it eventually. The reason she gave, very gently, very clearly, in a conversation I remember in physical detail, was that she felt like she was always talking to someone who was half somewhere else. "You're thinking about something I can't see," she said. "You've been thinking about it the whole time I've known you. I don't think you're going to stop." She wasn't wrong. I think about that sometimes, about what I traded, about the specific cost of carrying something like this for as long as I carried it. By year 6, I was 30 years old. I had a professional license, a modest portfolio, a salary that was adequate and not more than adequate, and an anger that had been running at low heat for so long it had begun to feel like just the temperature of my life. And then something happened that I did not plan and did not see coming. It wasn't a triumph. It wasn't a breakthrough. It was something much smaller and, in retrospect, much more important. I attended a weekend seminar on development financing. Let me explain something about the difference between designing buildings and developing them. When you work as an Architect for a developer, you are, in the power structure of that relationship, a service provider. You are hired to translate someone else's vision, their square footage targets, their cost per unit requirements, their return on investment calculations, into physical form. The developer owns the land. The developer controls the financing. The developer decides what gets built and what doesn't. The architect serves the project. The developer owns the project. I had spent 6 years in that dynamic without fully understanding it for what it was. I understood it professionally. The way you understand a rule you live inside. I had not understood it strategically. The seminar was 3 days long. It covered real estate finance, development economics, land acquisition strategy, and deal structuring. The presenter was a development professional named Theodore Barnes, a man in his early 60s who had built his career in commercial real estate and who spoke about the business of building with a directness and pragmatism that I found, in that weekend, almost physically clarifying. On the second day, he said something that I wrote down and have never forgotten. Every building that gets built is an idea that found money. It's never the other way around. The idea doesn't find money. You find money, and then the idea has a chance. I sat with that for the rest of the day, and then for the rest of the weekend, and then for the following month, during which I read everything I could find on real estate development, financing, development entities, project structures, and the mechanisms by which buildings go from concept to construction. Here is what I understood by the end of that month. Professor Coleman had not only stolen my design, he had known something I hadn't known. He had understood that a brilliant design, without the right financial and professional structure behind it, is just a drawing. He had taken my drawing and given it the structure it needed to become a building. He had known how to do that, and I had not. I could spend the rest of my life producing better designs, or I could learn to do what he did, and do it with my own work. I went back to school, not full-time. I kept my job. I enrolled in an evening MBA program with a real estate development concentration, 2 nights a week, Saturday mornings. It took 3.5 years. Those 3.5 years were not glamorous. They were one of the only periods of my adult life where I genuinely had no time to be angry. I was too busy. I got up at 5:30 every morning and reviewed financial models before work. I stayed at the office until 7, went to class until 10, drove home, and slept for 6 hours before doing it again. Lucas, who by this point had moved to Dallas and started a construction management firm, called every few weeks and asked what I was doing. Learning how they think, I said. Who's they? The people who decide what gets built. There was a pause. You're not going to do something stupid, are you? I'm going to do something very carefully planned, I said. That's not entirely reassuring. During this period, I also did something that felt, at the time, deeply unglamorous, and that turned out to be one of the most important decisions of my professional life. I took a job at a small development company, not as an architect, as a project manager. I took a pay cut to do it. My colleagues at the architecture firm thought I was having some kind of breakdown. One of the senior partners called me into his office and asked, genuinely concerned, whether I was all right. I told him I was pursuing a different direction. He said he thought that was a waste of my design ability. I thanked him and gave 2 weeks' notice. The development company was small, 12 people, mostly real estate professionals, and they used me primarily because I could read construction drawings and communicate with contractors and architects in their own language. But I spent every spare moment learning the other side of the table, how sites were identified and acquired, how financing packages were structured, how investors were sourced and how deals were presented to them, how the regulatory environment, zoning, entitlements, variance applications, shaped what was possible on a given parcel. I was 33 years old, and I was starting over from nearly nothing. I thought about quitting approximately once a week. I didn't quit. Before I tell you about the first deal, I want to tell you about the night I came the closest to abandoning the whole thing. I was 34. The MBA was finished. I had been at the development company for 2 years. I had a clear picture of how the industry worked, a growing professional network, and just enough saved capital to make one serious move if I was disciplined about it. I was also exhausted in a way that sleep did not fix, the kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with hours and everything to do with carrying something at full weight for a very long time. It was a Tuesday in February, around 11 at night. I was sitting at the desk in my apartment. Not the studio setup I'd had in graduate school, just a regular desk in a regular apartment that I'd been renting for 6 years, and I had laid out in front of me a pro forma for a potential site acquisition. The numbers worked. Not brilliantly, but they worked. The site was a former auto repair shop on a transitional block with the right zoning and a price that I could justify. I had been going over the numbers for 3 weeks, and I sat there at 11 on a Tuesday in February, and for the first time in 11 years, I genuinely asked myself, is this worth it? Not the business, not the project, the whole thing. The accumulated weight of the mission I had assigned myself at age 23, standing in the rain. The years of the low-frequency anger, the relationships I had given partial versions of myself to, the choices, the job changes, the pay cuts, the decade of learning the hard way, all of it in service of what, exactly? Of a promise I'd made to no one who could hold me to it, of a proof I intended to deliver to a man who had not thought about me in 20 years. I sat at that desk for a long time. I thought about what it would feel like to let it go, to simply stop, to invest the energy I had been directing at this invisible purpose toward something warmer, something present, something that existed in the same time zone as my actual life. And here is the honest thing. I could not find it in me to do that, not because of stubbornness exactly, more because of something simpler and harder to argue with. The work I had been learning to do, the integration of design vision and development execution, the specific way I thought about buildings as public artifacts rather than financial instruments. That work was real. It was good. Not as a vehicle for revenge, but on its own terms. The 9-year-old kid who looked at that civic center sketch and felt the key turn in his chest. He had been right about something, and the work was the truest expression of what he had been right about. I could not abandon the work. And the work was, by this point, inseparable from the trajectory that had begun in anger. So I sat there until midnight, and then I went to bed, and in the morning I called a commercial real estate broker and told him I wanted to move forward on the site. The first deal I did on my own was small enough that I'm almost embarrassed to include it in the story. Almost. But I include it because the size of the starting point matters. It's part of the honesty I owe you. I was 35. I had spent 4 years at the development company. I had saved aggressively, lived simply, and accumulated enough capital, combined with a small investors group I had assembled through networking with people from my MBA program to acquire a single parcel commercial property in a transitional neighborhood. A former auto repair shop with a good lot size and a terrible building. I had the building demolished and replaced with a small mixed-use structure. Ground floor retail, 4 floors of apartments above, 14 units total. Everything in the design prioritized the street-level experience. Wide sidewalks, transparent retail frontage, a narrow but carefully detailed covered entry that created exactly the kind of transition space I'd been thinking about since I was a student. It was not impressive by any external metric. It was 14 units. It was in a neighborhood that most of the real estate community was watching cautiously, but not yet betting on. It was finished 6 weeks behind schedule and over budget by 8%, both of which I absorbed personally, but I owned it fully. My name was on the LLC that owned the parcel. My name was on the design. My name was on the construction contract. Everything that building was mine. I stood outside it the day it was complete. It was a Tuesday morning in early spring, and the retail space was not yet leased, and 3 of the apartments were still vacant, and the sidewalk in front was a little rough because the paving contractor had to redo a section. I stood there and I looked at it, and I felt something that was not pride exactly. It was something more like beginning. The second deal came 18 months later. I had refinanced the first property and used the equity, combined with new investor capital, to acquire a larger parcel, 5 floors, 22 units, ground floor restaurant space. This time I was 16 months in the making, on schedule, on budget to within 3%. I made a choice on that project that I want to tell you about specifically, because it illustrates the kind of discipline this process required. There was a cheaper structural system available, a perfectly standard, perfectly adequate approach that would have saved me approximately $120,000 on the project. Every financial calculation said to take the cheaper system. But the cheaper system would have required a different ceiling height in the residential units, which would have changed the proportions of the windows, which would have changed the relationship between the interior space and the exterior light. I did not take the cheaper system. My financial partners were not happy about this. "You're losing $120,000 on a feeling about windows," one of them said. "I'm investing $120,000 in a building that will perform differently in the market over time," I said. I was right. The building leased at a premium to comparable units in the neighborhood. The restaurant tenant, who came to us specifically because of the space's quality, was one of the more successful openings in that part of the city that year. The building sold 4 years later at a margin that justified the decision many times over. But I want to be honest. I made that decision partly for the right financial reasons, and partly because I was building something. A track record, yes, but also a set of beliefs, a proof of concept, a demonstration, to myself first, and eventually to the market, that the way I thought about buildings was not just theoretically sound, but commercially viable. By the time I was 38, I owned 4 properties. By 40, 6. By 42, 9. The projects grew. The financing packages became more sophisticated. The investor base expanded. The design sensibility I had been developing since I was a kid in Ohio, that the relationship between a building and its public context was a form of responsibility, not just aesthetics, had become, by this point, a recognizable approach that the market had learned to associate with quality. I was not yet famous. I was not yet powerful in the way I would become, but I was building something that was entirely mine, and I was building it correctly, and for the first time in my professional life, I felt the gap between where I was and where I intended to be closing rather than widening. I want to pause here and ask you something, and I mean this sincerely. At what point would you have given up? Because I'm not going to pretend the 10 years between graduation and my first deal were anything other than a long grinding test. A lot of people I knew gave up on comparable things for better reasons. Drop in the comments. What's your line? What's the thing that, if it went wrong, would have ended the attempt for you? Here is something I've learned about power, real power, the durable kind, that I wish someone had told me when I was younger. It does not announce itself. The people who announce their power are usually in the early stages of it. The announcement is itself a form of insecurity, a flag planted to claim territory before the territory is truly secured. Genuine accumulation of power looks, from the outside, like boring competence, like a man who goes to work and does his job and makes his decisions and does not need external confirmation that the decisions were correct. This is what I was doing through my late 30s and into my 40s. Not hiding, but not performing either. Just building. The deals got bigger. The projects got more complex. I began to take on projects that required not just the acquisition and financing expertise I'd developed, but the full integration of design vision with development execution. I hired architects, but I directed them with a specificity that came from 20 years of thinking about buildings. The project showed it. The market noticed. The reputation compounded. By the time I was 43, I had completed 11 major projects. The cumulative value of my development portfolio was in the 9 figures. I had a staff of 31 people, architects, project managers, financial analysts, legal support. And I had begun taking meetings with institutional investors who had capital allocations in the hundreds of millions. I also, during this period, completed 2 projects that received genuine public recognition. One of them, a mixed-income residential complex on the east side of the city, was featured in a national architecture publication. The review described the building's ground-level design as unusually attentive to the relationship between the structure and its public surroundings. I read that phrase and I smiled, not because of the recognition, because of the phrase, earned height, 20 years later, in my own building. Professor Coleman's firm had, by this point, continued to practice but had not produced another project of the significance of the one built from my design. There had been 2 or 3 smaller projects, an academic appointment, some lecture circuit activity. He had received, on the strength of that one celebrated building, a sustained reputation that carried him through 2 decades. But reputations built on a single major work, without new work to sustain them, tend to develop a particular kind of fragility that isn't always visible from the outside. I knew his reputation better than I might have admitted. I won't pretend I wasn't watching. I was. Carefully, periodically, not obsessively. I had too much work to be obsessive about it. But I checked. I noticed when his firm's website went from 3 active projects listed to 1. I noticed when the lecture invitations seemed to come from smaller venues. I noticed when a younger faculty member at Hartfield took over the graduate thesis studio that had once been his. I was not surprised when things began to go wrong for him. I was not surprised because I had spent 20 years understanding how the ground beneath a built reputation operates, and I could see from a professional distance that his had been shifting for some time. The lawsuits I heard about through professional channels. In a field the size of ours, word travels. A former client, then a former associate who claimed design credit on a project, then a subcontractor dispute that metastasized into something larger and more expensive than it should have been. Legal problems, in a professional services context, feed on each other. Once one lawsuit becomes public, the ones that were waiting quietly in the background tend to find air. His investors, the development firm he'd been in partnership with since the beginning, separated from him. The terms of the separation were not announced, but the fact of it was. In professional circles, the absence of a long-term partnership is its own announcement. I knew all of this before the morning my secretary's voice came through the intercom. "Sir, there's a professor here to see you. He's been waiting in reception for just over 2 hours." I had not known exactly when it would happen, but I had known it would happen, and I had kept the blueprint in the safe, specifically because I had known. Let me tell you about the specific moment when I understood that the power dynamic between my past and my present had fully reversed. It was not the morning in the office with the blueprint. That was the culmination. The moment I'm describing was 3 years earlier. I was attending a real estate development symposium, an annual event I'd been going to for years, the kind where the guest list is a fairly reliable index of who matters in regional development. I was there for a panel I was moderating on mixed-use design. I was standing near the registration table before the event started, talking to a colleague, when someone tapped my arm. I turned around. It was a woman I knew slightly, an academic, a professor of urban planning from a university in the region, someone I'd crossed paths with at previous events. We had one of those professional acquaintanceships characterized by warmth and almost no actual depth. She said she needed to introduce me to someone. She turned to the man standing beside her and began the introduction, and then she stopped, because the man she had turned to was Professor Coleman, and he was looking at me, and something was happening on his face that took me a moment to parse. He didn't recognize me. That's what was happening. He was looking at the person his colleague was trying to introduce, and he saw a developer, a man with a reputation in the field, someone worth knowing. He did not see a 23-year-old graduate student standing in his office asking why his work had been removed from a competition. He put out his hand. He said his name. He said it was a pleasure. I shook his hand. I said mine. I watched his face. And there it was, very briefly, a fraction of a second, the flicker of something, a searching expression, the face a person makes when a sound or a smell or a name produces a sense of recognition they can't immediately locate. A ghost passing through a room, and then it was gone. He smiled. He said he had heard great things about my work. He said he hoped we'd have a chance to speak at the event. I said I hoped so too. We spoke for approximately 8 minutes during a coffee break. He was charming and knowledgeable and professionally deferential in the way that people are when they perceive they're speaking to someone with more current market standing than themselves. He mentioned his firm. He mentioned the project from 20 years ago, the celebrated building. Almost immediately, the way a person reaches for their most reliable credential. That project really defined a certain approach to the relationship between tall buildings and public space, he said. The concept of earned height, I said. Yes, I'm familiar with it. Another flicker. Slightly longer this time. Right, he said. Exactly, a phrase I've used to describe it. It's a useful phrase, I said, very specific. I let it sit there. I did not push. I had not come to that conversation ready to reveal anything. I had come to understand where things stood. And I understood, by the end of those 8 minutes, exactly where they stood. He needed the world to keep believing in him. He was working very hard to make sure it did. The world, however, was conducting its own assessment. Over the following years, and this is the period I think of as the invisible architecture of consequence, the thing that runs parallel to your own building and doesn't announce itself any more than yours does. Over those years, the situation continued to develop. His firm's project pipeline contracted. His academic role diminished. The lawsuits accumulated. The investors who had once been attached to his projects began to appear at my events instead, associated with my projects instead. I hired one of them, eventually, a financial partner named Garrett Sullivan, who had been involved with Professor Coleman's firm in its earlier, stronger period and who had, over dinner one evening, mentioned in the careful, elusive way that people in professional settings describe falling outs, that he had developed concerns about attribution practices in the previous relationship. I listened to that very carefully. I did not push on it either, but I filed it. I noted it. I understood what it meant. The ground had been shifting for a long time. The building was coming down slowly, the way they always come down, not in a dramatic collapse, but in the gradual withdrawal of the supports. I kept going to work. I kept doing my projects. I kept the blueprint in the safe. My office is on the 50th floor of a building I developed 6 years ago. It was the project that, in some internal accounting, I had always designated as the one I was most privately building toward, not because it was the largest or the most profitable, but because the site. The site was 3 blocks from the building he built from my design, the site where, on a November night, 22 years ago, I had stood in the rain, looking up at my own work with someone else's name on it. When I chose that site, when I fought for the entitlements, when I structured the financing, when I pushed the design through 18 months of development. Lucas, who had moved back to the city by then to run a regional office of his construction firm, asked me about the location choice over dinner. Proximity to the transit hub is a legitimate reason, he said. Is that the reason? That's one of the reasons, I said. And the other reason? I want to be able to see it from my desk, I said. Every day. Lucas was quiet. Is that healthy? He said finally. Probably not, I said. I'm going to do it anyway. The building I developed is 52 floors. It is, by every technical metric, more significant than his, more widely recognized, more financially successful. It has been in more publications. It has been cited more often in professional discussions. 2 years ago, I was invited to present it at a national architectural forum as an example of design-integrated development, a term used to describe the integration of architectural vision with development economics that I had by that point been practicing for 15 years. From my desk on the 50th floor on a clear day, you can see his building. It is several blocks away and partially obscured by the development that has happened around it since it was built. It is a handsome building. It deserved the recognition it received on the merits of the design, my design, even if the credit was given to the wrong person. I think about that sometimes, the strange, knotted quality of it. The building is genuinely good. It represents genuinely good thinking. And no one in the city who walks past it, or works in it, or sees it on the skyline, has the first idea that the wrong name is associated with it. They see a good building. They experience the public arcade that runs through its base, the threshold experience I designed when I was 22 years old. They don't know what to call it or who conceived it. That is its own form of consequence. The disconnect between what a thing is and what the world believes about it. I have lived in that disconnect for 20 years. The morning the secretary called through to say he was in reception, I was looking at his building. I had been looking at it when her voice came through. Not intentionally. I had been going through financial projections on a new site acquisition and had lifted my eyes from the screen and happened to land on it. The way you land on something familiar, so often it stops registering as a choice. How long has he been waiting? I asked. Just over 2 hours, sir. He was here when I arrived. He had come early. He had arrived before my staff. He had sat in a chair in my reception area for over 2 hours, knowing that the waiting was part of the process, willing to endure it. I understood what that meant, about where he was. Give him 5 more minutes, I said. Then send him in. I opened the safe. I took out the manila envelope. I removed the blueprint and unfolded it carefully on my desk. The paper was fragile along the fold lines, but intact. The pencil lines were clear. The handwritten annotations, in my handwriting, from October of my final year of graduate school, before any of the working sessions with him had begun, were readable. The coffee stain in the lower left corner was still there. I smoothed it flat with both hands. I placed it in the center of my desk. I sat back in my chair and I waited. He came through the door the way people come through the doors of offices that belong to people much more powerful than themselves. Tentatively, with a performed version of professional confidence that doesn't quite cover the awareness of the imbalance. He was in his late 70s now, smaller than I remembered, in the way people become smaller, when the authority that surrounded them is gone. He wore a good suit. He had always worn good suits, but it was slightly out of date in a way that registered subliminally. He looked at me the way he had looked at me at the symposium 3 years earlier. The face of a man performing recognition while actually searching his memory for context. A potential investor, a decision-maker whose support he needed. That was what he saw. He did not see me. My secretary closed the door behind him. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. He was standing near the chair across from my desk. I had not yet gestured for him to sit. "I know you're an extraordinarily busy man." "Sit down," I said. He sat. "I'll come directly to the point," he said. "My firm is in the process of concluding several outstanding matters, and I have one project, a final project, a commission that I've been developing for 3 years, that requires a development partner to move forward. It's a residential tower, 82 units, public amenity ground floor, a site I've been quietly assembling for 18 months. It's the right site. The design is strong. What's missing is a financial partner with the standing to bring institutional investors into a project of this scale. He paused. He had rehearsed this. The cadence was smooth. I've been advised by several people in the field that you are the right partner for this project, he said. That your track record, your relationships with institutional capital, and your approach to design integrated development align with what this project needs. He slid a folder across the desk toward me. I did not touch it. I looked at him for a long moment. He met my eyes with the professional ease of someone used to high-stakes meetings. But I could see the other thing underneath it. The thing 2 hours in reception does to a person. What does the ground floor look like? I asked. He blinked slightly. The design features a publicly accessible arcade, a covered passage connecting 2 street corridors, I said, with the tower body oriented slightly off the primary grid to create diagonal view lines to a public space. Something happened in his face, something very quiet and very cold. You've seen the design materials, he said carefully. No, I said. I haven't seen your materials. He was very still. I reached across my desk and pulled the blueprint toward me. I turned it so it was facing him, and I pushed it to the center of the desk between us. I watched him look at it. I watched the recognition arrive. Not of the drawing. He had surely had the drawing in his possession, had used the drawing, had presented the drawing to developers in competitions and journals. I watched him recognize the paper, the age of it, the coffee stain, the handwriting in the margins. He knew whose handwriting that was. Because he had sat across from me in his own office for months, watching me make notes in those same margins, the color left his. Nothing for a very long time. Outside my nothing for a very long time. Outside my window, 50 floors below, the city was going about its morning, taxis, foot traffic, delivery vehicles pulling up to loading docks, the specific anonymous busyness of a city that does not stop to witness private reckonings. How long have you, he started. The original was made in October, I said, of your graduate thesis studio year, before our working sessions. The date is on the envelope. He looked at the envelope, which was on the desk beside the blueprint. He could read the date in my handwriting. I'm not here to file a claim, I said. The statute of limitations on design theft is a complicated area of law, and I'm not a litigant by temperament. That's not what this meeting is. He looked at me. He was trying to reassemble something, some version of authority or composure. I could see the effort it cost. Then what is this meeting, he said. This is a meeting where you came to ask me to finance your final project, I said. And I am going to tell you my answer. He was very still. The answer is no, I said. Not because I can't. I can. The financing structure you've described is within my capacity, without material difficulty. The site, from what I know of it, is a good site. The program is viable. You could find a partner. It won't be me. I let that land. I want to be specific about why, I said. Not for your benefit. I don't owe you an explanation, and you don't deserve one. But I want to say it out loud, in this room, today, because I have been waiting 20 years to say it out loud, in a room where you could hear it. I looked at him across the desk. I kept my voice level. I had no interest in performance, no interest in drama. This was not a scene I was playing. This was a fact I was stating. You took my work, I said. You took the best idea I had produced up to that point in my life, the idea I had built across months of the most serious intellectual effort of my education, and you used your professional position and your institutional access to extract it from me piece by piece, remove my entry from the competition through administrative means, and present it to the world under your name. You accepted awards for it. You built a reputation on it. You gave a generation of students lectures on public design using a conceptual framework you stole from one of them. He did not deny it. He had no energy left for denial, I think. Or perhaps he had enough dignity remaining to understand that denial would accomplish nothing in this room. I want you to understand something clearly, I said. I built everything you see from this window without that project. I built it the long way, the correct way, and I have enough standing in this field and enough relationships with the institutional capital you need that if I wished to be active about this, I could make the remaining years of your professional life considerably more difficult than they are already becoming. I'm not going to do that, because it would require continuing to give you my attention and my energy, and those are no longer things I'm willing to spend on you. I folded the blueprint carefully. I placed it back in the envelope. You should know, I said, that I own the building across from yours, the one you can see from the public arcade you designed, the one that has, in 6 years, received more professional recognition than yours received in 20. I don't say that to wound you, although I understand it does. I say it because I want you to understand that the idea you took from me did not end with you. It was the beginning of something you had no part in and no ownership of, and it went further than what you built with it. I stood up. He stood up, more slowly. I'll have my assistant validate your parking, I said. I hope the drive back is manageable. He stood there for a moment. He was looking at me with something I could not fully read, something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, something in between. He said very quietly, I did recognize the potential. I know, I said. That's what made it possible. I walked to the door and opened it. My secretary, Courtney, was at her desk in the outer office. She looked up with her professional expression. Professor Coleman is leaving, I said. Please validate his parking. She said, of course. He walked past me. He walked through the outer office. He did not look back. I stood in the doorway and watched him go. And then I went back to my desk and I sat down, and I looked out the window at the city I had built, the city that does not know my whole story and does not need to, and I held the manila envelope in both hands. Let me tell you what happened to the people in this story. Professor Coleman's final project did not get built, not because I blocked it. I did not. I had nothing further to do with him, and I meant that completely. But the financing he needed did not materialize, and the development partners who might have been interested had concerns about his firm's outstanding legal matters that proved insurmountable. The site was eventually sold to another developer. I heard later that the project was redesigned from the ground up. His name was not on it. He retired from professional practice the following year. He retained his reputation, at least formally, at least in the way that biographical summaries retain the shape of a career long after the career has ended. His celebrated building still stands. It still functions. People still walk through the public arcade at its base and experience the space without knowing anything about its origins. That is its own kind of outcome. The work survives, disconnected from the lie it was born from. I am not at peace with that. I want to be clear. The fact that the building is good, that people use it, that the design I made continues to operate in the world, that is not a comfort. It remains an injury, a specific, named injury that I carry with less weight than I used to, but have not set down. Lucas Walker remained one of my closest friends. He built his construction firm into one of the most respected in the region, and his company has been the general contractor on 4 of my projects, which I count among the professional relationships I am most proud of. When I told him about the office meeting, not the day of, but a few weeks later over dinner, he listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. How do you feel? He said. Strange, I said. I thought I would feel more. More what? More finished, more resolved. I thought it would feel like something closing. Does it? I thought about it. It feels like something that was loud for a very long time that has gone quiet, but the quiet isn't the same as the thing being gone. Lucas nodded. He understood that. The investors who had been connected to my development work over the years, included, at various points, people who had professional histories that overlapped with Professor Coleman's. Garrett Sullivan, the financial partner who had mentioned attribution practices in his previous professional relationship. He remained in my orbit for several years and eventually became a limited partner in 2 of my larger projects. He never mentioned the professor again, neither did I. Emily, the woman who had ended our relationship by telling me I was always half somewhere else. I looked her up once, about 8 years after we'd broken up. She had married, was working in a senior role in urban planning, had 2 children based on what I could see. She looked, from the distance of a LinkedIn profile, like someone who had made good choices. I am glad about that, and I carry a specific regret that I do not romanticize but do not pretend isn't there, that the best version of me I could offer during those years was, as she said, half somewhere else. She deserved the full version. She did not get it. There were others. The outside critic at the thesis exhibition, who gave me her card and said to reach out. I reached out, eventually, years later, when I was beginning to build my reputation in the field. She remembered me. She served as a professional reference at a critical juncture in my early development career. I have never forgotten that a stranger's sincere recognition, given at the right moment, can carry a person through years. My parents are both still living, in their mid-80s now, in the same house where I grew up. My father still talks about what I do with a pride that is slightly bewildered, I think. Bewildered in the warm way of someone who knew their child was going towards something they didn't fully understand, and is pleased it turned out to be real. My mother keeps a photograph of the building I told her about, the first one, the 14-unit mixed-use project, framed in the hallway. Not any of the later, larger ones, the first one. I love that about her. I promised you the full story. I promised you the part that is not triumphant. Here it is. I am 51 years old. I have built, in the most literal sense, significant parts of the city where I live. My work has housed thousands of people, created commercial spaces that have become embedded in the daily life of neighborhoods, generated wealth for investors and value for tenants and something like beauty, modest, durable, honest beauty, for the streets that hold my buildings. I have also been, for most of my adult life, in a relationship primarily with the past. Not exclusively, not entirely. I have friends, I have professional relationships that I genuinely value. I have moments, sometimes long stretches of them, where I am fully present and genuinely connected to the work and the people around me. But there is a part of me that was formed in the anger of what happened when I was 23, and that part did not grow in the same direction as the rest of me. It grew sideways, it grew inward. It became the thing that drove me through the years when driving was the only option, and it became, eventually, a structure inside me so load-bearing that I could not remove it without wondering what would remain. I think about the cost constantly, not always in obvious ways, but in the specific texture of certain evenings when the work is done, and the office is quiet, and I'm looking out at the skyline I spent decades helping build, and I feel something that is not emptiness, but is adjacent to it, a space where something else might have been if I had been pointed differently, if I had been wounded differently, or not at all. The revenge, because that is what this was, I'll call it what it is. The revenge was total, not in a cinematic way. There were no explosions, no public humiliations, no announcements. It was the cold, complete, irrefutable revenge of showing up in the room where he needed something and being the person who could provide it, and choosing not to. Of having built, over 20 years, something so far beyond anything he had done that the distance itself was the statement. It worked. It was real. When I placed that blueprint on my desk and watched the color drain from his face, something genuine happened in that room. Something that 22-year-old kid standing in the rain had promised himself would happen. But I want to tell you something that the movies don't tell you about this kind of ending. The satisfaction is real, and it does not last long. What lasts is the awareness of how much of yourself you spent getting there. Not in the sense of regret. I do not regret what I built. I am proud of it in ways that feel foundational, but in the sense of recognizing what the building required. The years of not being fully present for other people, the relationships that got half of me at best. The mornings I woke up and the first clear thought was not about my life, or my work, or the people I cared about, but about him, about proving something to a person who, in the end, could not even remember my face. That is the thing I want you to sit with. Not as a warning necessarily, not as a reason to forgive people who don't deserve it, or to let go of things that deserve to be held, but as a true account of what the long game actually costs. I won, completely, finally, without question. I also spent 20 years of my life primarily in the service of the wound, and there is a version of me, quieter, probably less successful by conventional measures, maybe more present, maybe more capable of giving the full version to someone who deserved it. That version of me did not get to exist because I was busy with this. I carry both of those things. I carry them the way I carry the blueprint, carefully in a container designed to protect them, not displayed but not discarded, because they are both true, and because I think the truth of both of them is worth more than the clean version of either. One last question for the comments, and I mean this as genuinely as I can. If you could go back and tell that 23-year-old kid standing in the rain something, what would it be? Knowing that the long road leads somewhere. Knowing what the somewhere costs. What do you say to him? I've been thinking about it for 20 years, and I still don't know the answer. It is 7:58 in the morning now, on the same day. He left about 40 minutes ago. My secretary has brought coffee. She always does after difficult meetings, without being asked, which is one of the many reasons I have been fortunate to work with her. I have drunk half of it. The blueprint is back in the envelope, and the envelope is back in the safe, and the safe is closed. I'm looking at the skyline. From up here you can see the full arc of the older buildings from the mid-century, the glass and steel of the boom decades, the newer structures that have been going up on the east side of the district where the market has been moving. You can see my buildings, not all of them, but several. I know them by their silhouettes. The way a musician hears their own instrument in an orchestra, even when there are many instruments playing. And you can see his building, 3 blocks south, partially occluded by the developments that have grown up around it, still standing, still hosting the arcade that carries a few dozen pedestrians through its covered passage at this hour of the morning, people walking from the transit station to their offices, not thinking about threshold spaces or earned height, or the long journey that an idea can take from a graduate student's drafting table to a city's permanent skyline. They don't know the story, they experience the space. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it has to be. I finished my coffee. I pulled up the site acquisition proposal I had been reviewing before the intercom call. The numbers were good. The site was right. There was another building to make. There is always another building to make. That, in the end, is what I learned from all of this. Not the revenge, not the vindication, but the work itself, the disciplined, patient, non-performing accumulation of real things, built from real thinking in the real world. That is the only thing that actually holds. The only thing that doesn't depend on what anyone else said about it or did with it, or whether they remembered your name when they saw your face across a conference room 20 years later. The work holds. Build the work. If this story made you feel something, drop it in the comments. I read every one. And if you know someone who's in year 2 of their long road, someone who's still standing in the rain looking up at something that should have been theirs, send this to them. Not to tell them it gets better. It does, but that's not the point. Send it so they know the road is real, and the destination is real, and the cost is real, and someone who walked it is telling them the truth about all 3.